Good evening, I'm Anthony Robart. This is Crime Beat, the stories behind some of Canada's most high-profile homicides, told by the reporters who walk the beat every day, and the families demanding answers.
Tonight, 5 people were stabbed in the biggest mass killing in Calgary's history. The young man who did it was found not criminally responsible, and could he one day be free?
He is on an accelerated path to absolute discharge. He is no longer supervised by anyone.
Why would you take the risk of all of society for this one person?
Some people seem to think that deep down he's just a psychotic killer and he's welcoming the opportunity to revert to that status. And that's ridiculous.
There's one woman who understands the anguish of this path like few others can. The mother of the man who was beheaded on a Greyhound bus.
I don't think I'll ever come to terms with the fact that he is allowed to walk free with no criminal record. Their incurable illness is too delicate.
Here's Nancy Hixt with the conclusion of the Brentwood 5 massacre.
Lawrence Hong, Katie Paris, Jordan Segura, Josh Hunter, and Zachariah Rathwell were all young, talented, and had promising futures. What started out as a party to mark the end of classes at the University of Calgary ended with 5 young people's lives being stolen in a sudden, unprovoked stabbing spree. Because they were killed at a house party in the Calgary neighborhood of Brentwood, they became affectionately known as the Brentwood 5. It was a tragedy that left a scar on the soul of the city. In the course of 3 days, 5 funerals were held. The entire city grieved along with their families. Two weeks after they were killed, a public memorial was held at the University of Calgary. Each family shared special memories of their loved ones. That day, Lawrence would have turned 28. His brother Miles spoke on behalf of the Hong family.
So the last time I spoke to my brother, he comforted me on my birthday by talking about the future. Today, on his birthday, I can't comfort him. He has left a mark. He will not be forgotten. Happy birthday, Lawrence. We'll miss you. Thank you.
Katie and I shared a very special bond, as most sisters do. She was my person, and I was hers. We may have lost our sister, but we know that whenever we follow our own spirits and we live our passions, that she'll be right there with us.
Standing here in front of all of you takes a lot of courage, but I can hear Jordan say, "You can do it, Mom."
The band is over now because we lost half of our family, and I cannot express how much that hurts. So for my family's sake, the family that consisted of Joshua Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell, Barry Mason, and myself, just keep on dancing and keep on carrying on. Much love.
I'm so sad that they're all gone now.
But I'm so happy and so grateful and so thankful that we had them in our lives at all. It was only 21 years, but thank you, Zach. Thank you. I love you.
The man who took these 5 lives was Matthew DeGrood. He was originally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. His mental state at the time of the fatal stabbings became the focal point of the trial.
More courtroom debate about whether Matthew DeGrood was faking mental illness in the horrific Brentwood killings. A third expert testified today about DeGrood's state of mind. Nancy Hixt reports on his findings.
Experts say Matthew DeGrood suffered from a disease of the mind when he stabbed and killed 5 young people at a house party 2 years ago. The 24-year-old admits he killed Lawrence Hong, Josh Hunter, Katie Paris, Zachariah Rathwell, and Jordan Segura. But 3 independent psych assessments have deemed DeGrood lacked the ability to know that his actions were morally wrong. DeGrood believed that the world was going to end, that those around him were the Illuminati, and that he had to kill to escape the situation. Doctors spent extensive time checking if DeGrood was faking his symptoms, but in the end, experts say he was in a psychosis suffering from schizophrenia. At the end of the trial, a judge found Matthew DeGrood not criminally responsible, or NCR, for the killings. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, DeGrood began taking medication and was sent to a secure psychiatric facility. He's continually assessed by doctors who report his status to the Alberta Review Board, or the ARB. That review board looks at his case on a yearly basis and decides if there's still a significant threat to the safety of the public. To determine that risk, the board looks at the likelihood of DeGrood becoming psychotic again, and what he would likely do if he did.
Every year after the review board, I probably spend a couple months just trying to climb back out of that darkness. And it doesn't get easier because each time he's that much closer to being out.
The families of the Brentwood 5 relive the trauma over and over again as they present victim impact statements at each ARB hearing.
It takes us right back to the day we found out she died, thinking about her autopsy report, seeing her in a casket, frozen solid, lifeless. Like, every one of those images goes through your head for the next 6 months on either side. And then we got to start all over again next year.
The way the system is set up, they never get a chance to heal.
It's something I've had to experience as time goes. Nobody has sat us down and said, this is how you do this. We figured things out as we go along.
It would be nice not to have to think about it.
Yeah.
But every year, and you know, you get going up to this April 15th, and when they died, and then in September now we're doing the reviews, and you know, it's just a constant, and it would be nice to try and heal somehow.
There's no healing in this for all of us. It's just it's a continuous loop, and there's no healing in the review board process. There's no support in the system for the families.
The very first hearing to review DeGrood's status was held in July of 2016, less than 2 months after the trial.
Once a year we go and do this. We don't have to, but we have to. I think the board would be much, much happier if we didn't. The review board is not about the index offense. It is not about the people that are left. It is about the patient. It is about his well-being, his progress, his support.
We just could not get out of that grief. It's a difficult situation that I never encountered, and I hope that nobody, no other parents should ever go through what we went through. It should never have happened. No parents deserve that. Nobody deserves this. But here we are.
To date, including the trial, the families have presented victim impact statements 5 times, with another hearing scheduled for September of 2020.
Coming up on Crime Beat. From the moment DeGrood was found not criminally responsible, the 5 families expressed concerns about his future. They've seen other killers found NCR walk free. That's coming up after the break. The families of the Brentwood 5 are concerned about the risk to public safety if Matthew DeGrood would one day be given absolute freedom. We now return to Nancy Hixt.
Each time DeGrood's case is looked at by the Alberta Review Board, the families of the Brentwood 5 fear he'll be granted an absolute discharge, free to go about his life. It's not up to DeGrood to prove he isn't a risk. Rather, it's up to the board to find evidence that he is a risk. The law in Canada states the board has to impose the least onerous restrictions while protecting the safety of the public. Just 10 months after he was declared not criminally responsible, DeGrood began asking for increased freedoms.
Well, as you can imagine, this has been an extremely emotional and draining process for the families of the 5 young people that were killed by Matthew DeGrood. 20 tear-filled victim impact statements were read during the hearing today. Many of these people were pleading with the board to keep DeGrood in a secure facility.
We, the 5 families, vehemently disagree with the treatment team's request for additional privileges outside of the secure hospital facility where there are no fences or security measures.
The following year, in 2018, 2 years after being declared NCR, DeGrood was moved to a secure facility in Edmonton. Doctors described DeGrood as a model patient, and at that time he was granted unsupervised ground privileges, as well as passes into the city as long as he was supervised by a responsible adult. Both of his parents had been granted that status. He was also allowed to leave for 24 hours at a time to stay with his family. By 2019, his freedoms were again increased exponentially.
The families of the 5 young people killed by Matthew DeGrood are calling for an immediate review of the decision to grant him more freedom. DeGrood was found not criminally responsible, and tonight there are renewed calls for greater accountability in these types of cases. Global's Nancy Hixt is working on this story and joins us now with more. Nancy.
There are 3 options for people deemed not criminally responsible. They can be sent to a secure facility for treatment, they can be granted a conditional discharge or an absolute discharge.
The ultimate goal of the entire NCR process is to rehabilitate, reintegrate, and let them go on their way. Absolute discharge with no checking in. He is on a path, an accelerated path to absolute discharge, where people need to understand he is no longer supervised by anyone. He does not have to go to a psychiatrist and check in. He does not have to have his drugs, tested to see how much drugs he has in his system, to see he's taking his drugs. He's completely free to go.
In 2019, there was evidence of mental deterioration when a change was made to DeGrood's medication. His symptoms were insomnia and increased activity. Doctors said there was under-recognition and under-reporting by DeGrood of his developing symptoms. What this means is doctors feel when DeGrood's medication is working, he has a good understanding of his mental health and the need for treatment. When his medication is not working, his perception deteriorates along with his condition.
They're not better, they're medicated. They're never going to be better. He's schizophrenic, there's no cure. He's medicated, he's not better.
While he still lives in the secure facility in Edmonton, he's allowed unsupervised visits into the city, overnight passes that extend to a week, and he can travel anywhere in the province for up to a week with a responsible adult. The doctors who treat and assess DeGroote testify at each of the hearings and have made it clear schizophrenia cannot be cured. It can be managed. According to the most recent decision, if DeGroote stops taking his medication, he's likely to relapse within weeks or months, and the relapse is likely to become full-blown. Doctors also testified that the violence could once again be catastrophic if he does re-enter a psychotic state. All of these things raise more questions for the 5 families. How can anyone be sure he'll take his medication, and if those meds are even working, unless he's in a secure facility or continually monitored in the community?
So you're telling me that the drugs that he's taking are fine, and he probably won't reoffend. But if he does, it will be catastrophic. He will kill people. He'll kill everyone in the room. And I just don't understand how anyone is willing to take that chance.
From what I understand, stress is his biggest trigger. So how much stress is it? But how much of that is going to take him so that his meds aren't maybe enough meds because he's been triggered with this stress or that sort of thing? And who wants to, I just don't understand who wants to take that risk. We know our kids paid with their lives, you know, for what he did and his illness.
Absolute discharge would be the ultimate. He doesn't have to report to anybody. Nobody's going to be monitoring him. He could do whatever he wants.
I don't know what else to say to people to convince them that it's their problem too, not just the problem of the 5 families, and this needs to change. Matthew DeGroote cannot be giving an absolute discharge.
Change to the criminal code that would prevent somebody that's committed violent crime or murder from ever being absolutely discharged.
At a minimum.
Coming up on Crime Beat, a man who killed and beheaded a young man in one of Canada's most high-profile cases walks free. Could that happen in Matthew DeGroote's case? Welcome back to Crime Beat. It was a case that shocked the nation. A young man brutally attacked and beheaded by a stranger on a Greyhound bus. Why the Brentwood 5 families fear their case could end up with the same shocking outcome. Here's Nancy Hixt.
The one person who can relate to the anxiety the families of the Brentwood 5 are experiencing is Carol Dedeli, Timothy McLean's mother.
He was a free spirit, he was wild, he rather undisciplined, but so fun. Like he's just left such a void. He was so bright and energetic and electric.
Timothy was an adventurer at heart.
Timothy was very much a minimalist. He liked to sofa surf. He traveled lightly. Pretty much everything he possessed was in a backpack. He had been working with the carnival. I think this was his 3rd summer going across the provinces.
While traveling on the carnival circuit, Timothy always made time for his mom.
He would call me from just about everywhere that he was staying to ask for a chewy double chocolate cookie recipe. And he would make them wherever he was living. I didn't have a cell phone, or if I did, I had just gotten one. Now, I mean, I would take a picture of it and send it, but back then, no, I'd have to give it to him over the phone each and every time. But yeah, his friends still call and ask for that recipe. In fact, one did 3 days ago.
In June of 2008, Timothy made sure he was back in Manitoba for his younger brother's graduation. After that, he headed back to work on the carnival circuit.
The last time I saw my son, he was crossing the street from the hotel when we left. 1 minute. It was a warm summer evening, beautiful night. But when we were leaving, he was going the opposite way from ourselves to go to our vehicles. And he was in the middle of the street, no cars coming, and he turned around and he said, "Bye, Mom, I love you. I'm gonna be famous one day." And he turned around and went to his car. I had no idea the last day on the world, on this earth, would make him famous, but it has.
At the end of July that same year, Timothy rode a Greyhound bus across the prairies with the goal of ending up back home in Winnipeg. On July 30th, 2008, Timothy's mom had on the news as she prepped that night's dinner.
I remember us all being so, oh my God, that's so horrible. When I initially heard it, my first response was, what state did that happen in? And then my next response was, oh my God, that happened here. That happened close to here. Then I realized it was less than an hour from where we are. We all said a prayer for the family and the murdered person.
What she saw on the news shocked an entire nation. A man riding on a Greyhound bus west of Winnipeg had repeatedly stabbed and mutilated another passenger. The victim was beheaded.
I remember saying to the senior ladies, well, that my son would have been on that bus, but he came home 2 days earlier or whatever, and turned out I was wrong.
It never crossed Carol's mind that the victim could be her son.
But it was 24 hours after the killing before before Timothy was positively identified and we were informed. The reason they said it took so long, they didn't want to make any mistakes with his identity, and it was difficult to make that identification because of the mass destruction of his body. I knew a lot of what had happened to that individual on the bus before I knew it was my child. And when I heard it was my child, it just hit me like nothing could ever hit you like that again. It was so surreal, so unbelievable that it was just not wanting to sink in. I felt like I was standing on a precipice of craziness. That I could have lost my mind right there, because I remember it being so horrific that I wanted to laugh. I hit the ground, I landed on my knees, and I screamed. I ran out the front door and I screamed, no. But I know that at that moment, I felt like I was right on the edge. And I had to yank myself back, because it could have gone. It could have gone the other way.
The bus was pulled over and passengers were stretching their legs. Carol's son, Timothy McLean, smiled at a stranger named Vince Lee. Later, Timothy returned to his seat at the back of the bus, put his earbuds in, closed his eyes, and rested his head against the window. The stranger, Vince Lee, took a seat next to Timothy. Shortly after that, and without warning, Lee violently attacked him. Witnesses reported hearing Timothy scream. He jumped up and tried to defend himself, but Lee easily overpowered him, and he had nowhere to go. The first 2 stab wounds were fatal, but the attack continued.
There were over 100 stab wounds to his body. The first 2 were fatal, neck and upper chest. He didn't suffer for a long time, which was good. But the mutilation that occurred following his initial death is what I struggle with.
While the violence against Timothy went on, the driver and other passengers escaped. RCMP and special negotiators were outside of the bus for nearly 5 hours. During that time, Vince Lee kept stabbing and mutilating Timothy. I need to warn you, these details are graphic. Lee removed Timothy's internal organs and then cannibalized him. He took Timothy's severed head, held it in his hand, and taunted onlookers. Lee opened a window on the bus and jumped out, and he was finally arrested. Timothy's ear, nose, and tongue were found in Lee's pocket. He was charged with second-degree murder. Less than a year later, Lee was found not criminally responsible for his actions. Court heard he had a history of mental illness that was documented since at least 2004. Lee suffered from auditory hallucinations and believed he heard the voice of God telling him to kill Timothy. After being declared NCR, he was sent to a mental health facility in Manitoba, and in the years that followed, his freedoms were gradually increased. In 2016, less than 8 years after he killed Timothy McLean, Vince Lee changed his name to Will Baker. That same year, the review board allowed him to live on his own in a Winnipeg apartment, while subject to conditions and nightly monitoring to make sure he took his medication. It was only a few months later, in February 2017, less than 9 years after the brutal Greyhound slaying, Vince Lee, aka Will Baker, was granted an absolute discharge. That ruling gave him complete freedom.
I don't think I'll ever come to terms with the fact that he is allowed to walk free with no criminal record. Their incurable illness is too delicate. They have to constantly monitor medications and change them up. And in order to find that right combination to control their illness, I don't think individuals like Vince Lee that are so extreme are capable of doing that for themselves. I think they need to be in an environment that is aimed and catered to providing them the care that they need. That's the most humane thing I can think of to do with a mentally ill killer that has proven themselves to be this violent, this unpredictable. If there is no legal mechanism in place that requires them to treat their illness, I don't think that they should be reintegrated back into society. And currently, there is no legal mechanism requiring them to treat their illness.
According to a 1999 ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada, R versus Winco, a review board must order an absolute discharge if a person doesn't pose a significant threat to public safety. And in Lee, or Baker's case, the board ruled he no longer posed a threat.
How many more innocent people are going to die at the hands of a not criminally responsible killer who then is freed with no criminal record to do it again?
My name is Carol DeDelli, and I am Timothy McLean's mother.
Timothy's mother has since fought to change legislation. She believes absolute discharges should be taken off the table for killers deemed to be not criminally responsible. But so far, that change hasn't happened.
I don't want to hear talk anymore. I've met all the politicians. I took this to the Senate of Canada. I presented to the House of Commons and to the Senate committee. It's not that they're not aware. I know that they're aware because I told them myself. Now it's up to everybody else to use their voice.
In light of what happened in that case, the families of the Brentwood Five worry Matthew DeGrude will also be granted an absolute discharge.
Coming up on Crime Beat, Matthew DeGrude promises he'll always take his medication and says he could be trusted if granted an absolute discharge. We'll hear from his lawyer after the break. Matthew DeGrude has been described as a model patient, and his freedoms are increasing. But is there a guarantee he would always take his medication? And what are the risks if he doesn't? We now return to Nancy Hixt with the Brentwood 5 Massacre.
The Alberta Review Board has expressed concern that if Matthew DeGrude goes off his medication, his insight would decrease and create a real risk that he could continue to deteriorate to a point where medications are avoided. But his defense lawyer, Alan Fay, maintains that won't be an issue.
The bottom line is this: at this point, as a result of his medication, Matthew DeGroote is rational. He is well. He recognizes that if he does not take his medication, he will become unwell again. And in an unwell state, he could hurt someone. That is the last thing that Matthew DeGroote wants. That is the last place that Matthew DeGroote wants to go. Matthew DeGroote is dedicated to doing everything in his power to remaining well. And if that means taking medication for the rest of his life, he has made it clear he's prepared to do that. And he doesn't need a conditional discharge to ensure he does that. I mean, again, there seems to be this illusion that he's just looking for the opportunity to go off his medication. He's not.
DeGroote maintains he'll always take his medication.
Let's be clear. My client has been completely medication compliant from the get-go. He wants to take his medication. He wants to remain well. He does not want to ever go back to where he was. And I think the problem here is some people seem to think that deep down he's just a psychotic killer, and he's welcoming the opportunity to revert to that status. And that's ridiculous.
I think, you know, the families have expressed concern that if he would be someone who wants to be compliant and always take his medication, then why not consent to a conditional discharge where you would be mandated, you would have to check in, and there would be checks and balances to make sure you would take your medication? Why not consent to that?
Well, first and foremost, it's not a question of him consenting. It's what the Alberta Review Board directs.
But could he not proactively say, I'm not asking for an absolute discharge. Take it off the table. Let me sign this paper and say that that's what I would do. I guess that's what the families are wondering.
But by law, he's entitled to an absolute discharge. All he wants, all I want for him, are what he is legally entitled to. The same way as the families of the victims want what they are legally entitled to. The law of Canada sets out the procedure. It sets out what should happen.
As it stands now, under current Canadian law, if the board deems Matthew DeGroote no longer poses a risk to the public, he must be granted a conditional or an absolute discharge.
So, if this person's doing really well and following their treatment, then how would I find that this person poses a significant risk at this point in time? And so again, in Winco, the court says you can't just speculate about down the road at some point in the future if he was to stop taking his medication. That's not a sufficient basis for restricting his liberty at this time.
So we will start with Mr. Bailey.
Forensic psychologist Dr. Patrick Bailey testified before parliamentary justice committees to look at amendments to the criminal code. Nationally, there are approximately 400 NCR cases every year. Less than 10% of those involve serious personal violence or homicide. Dr. Bailey says most of those cases eventually result in absolute discharges. The problem is, if the board grants an absolute discharge to someone found to be NCR for a serious violent offense, and then that person goes off their medication, the risk to the public can be extreme.
We certainly know countless cases of individuals who stop taking their medication because they believe that they're now well, or they don't like the side effects of the medication, and so they opt to stop taking it because some of those side effects can accumulate over time. Or we know, unfortunately, that some of the medications stop being effective. And so unless you have that ongoing monitoring, even if this person is willing to take their medication, it might not be working for them anymore. So why not continue to have some measure of monitoring for these relatively rare personal injury cases?
The issue once again comes back to Canadian legislation.
So my suggestion has been that the notion of an absolute discharge could be taken off the table for those relatively rare serious personal injury offenses. So let me be clear, there are some people in the mental health community who don't appreciate me having advanced the idea because they see it as restricting the liberty of somebody who's otherwise earned an absolute discharge. I understand that. I also understand what I consider to be very reasonable public concern about individuals who've committed serious violent offenses being in a position where they obtain an absolute discharge and they're no longer under any supervision. I don't think that the supervision is onerous to say you will continue to see your psychiatrist, you'll continue to take medications as directed, and once a year you're going to come back before the review board for us to decide how you're doing.
It all might sound like a simple enough fix, but so far the Canadian government has not taken action. Timothy McLean's mom wanted those changes to happen before the man who killed her son was released without any conditions. That didn't happen. Now, the families of the Brentwood Five want federal politicians to take action before DeGroote is granted an absolute discharge, because that is the path he's currently on.
So he could be your neighbor, he could change his name like Vince Lee did. And so that should be scary to everybody out there, that he's on a path to be completely unsupervised. This is why we're speaking now, because they're starting exactly what Vince Lee did at year 6. In year 3 for DeGroote. DeGroote's there at year 3. By the end of this year, he's going to be living in a supervised halfway house. But you see the progression. That's what everyone should be afraid of.
We just really wishes that nothing will happen to other people. Nobody deserves to go through the grief that we're going through.
Clearly, he's ill and violent when he's not on his medication. I don't know. For me personally, it's just what are you willing to risk as a society? And, that means laws need to be changed.
This could happen to anybody's children. Anybody's. It could happen to anybody's loved ones. It could happen at Walmart when they're shopping or at Tim Hortons in the lineup. As long as they give Matthew DeGroote freedom, everybody is at risk, wherever they go.
Why would you take the risk of all of society for this one person?
Coming up on Crime Beat, the families vow to keep fighting until the law is changed. And at the same time, they are struggling to deal with never-ending, overwhelming grief. There would be no closure for the families of the Brentwood Five. In fact, the stress would only increase over time. But there is one bright spot, a place where their loved ones will always be remembered. We now return to Nancy Hixt with the conclusion of the Brentwood Five massacre.
It's been more than 6 years since the Brentwood Five were killed. Their families try to move forward, but grief will hit them when they least expect it. Lorenzo and Marlene Hong think of Lawrence every time they enjoy a good meal.
Cooking. He has a very good taste bud.
Yeah,
and he would remember sauces from other restaurants that he would, whenever there's a new place or a recommended restaurant, he would be there and he will have a memory of all those sauces and flavors. He will come back home and look at our pantry and start testing it.
For Shannon Miller, an overwhelming sense of grief can be brought on any time, any day, in an instant.
Anytime I smell popcorn, that was Katie's go-to food. She really loved popcorn. So when I smell popcorn, that reminds me of her. Driving has changed for me. I probably shouldn't have been driving for a few years afterwards even. But even now, if I see a white car with a young girl with a messy bun in her hair, it's that one split second of oh, that's Katie. No, it's not.
Patty Segura thinks of Jordan every day, but it's on special occasions that it hits her the hardest.
People think that the first year is the hardest year, and that's not accurate with me. The first year was a very difficult year, but the Christmases after don't get any better. Jordan's birthday, I do everything I can to honor Jordan. And it just makes me angry. And then by the time his birthday's over, I'm sad and I'm crying because he's not here. I cook his favorite meal, and Julie and Antonella come over and we have what Jordan would have wanted. But it does not get easier.
For the Hunters, it's some of the simplest of times with Josh that they miss the most.
I have a hard time talking about it without sorry. That's the things that I miss the most, is just our home time. And in the mornings I'd get up and go down, and he was good buddies with our dog, and I'd take the dog out of the mudroom and go into his room, and the dog would hop up on the bed and he'd stretch right out along Josh, and we'd sit there and have a conversation, you know, just what he was up to, what his day was going to be like, and he'd sit there and scratch the dog and just have a chat and start the day and then be off. And I miss those times a lot.
Rhonda Lee Rathwell struggles daily with overwhelming grief.
You know, I'd make a grocery list and he'd add what he needed. I put on a coat, a raincoat, and in it was an old grocery list that had my writing and then had the things that he wanted. So the absolute terror and shock that he must have been in when this person turned on him and started stabbing him, I go there, and that stops the grieving process.
The families of the Brentwood Five are creating a special place where they'll be able to honor their kids and find solace. It's called the Quintera Legacy Garden. It will be a peaceful and vibrant outdoor space where visitors can reflect, heal, and remember. The families want to reflect the qualities the Brentwood Five embodied, including hope, possibility, and creativity. It's a place where the spirits of Lawrence, Katie, Jordan, Josh, and Zach can live on, and everyone can see that beyond tragedy and loss, there is light.
The recidivism rate for people found to be NCR for serious violent offenses is relatively low. In one 3-year study, it was 6%. However, there are at least 2 known high-profile cases where offenders who were declared NCR for violent crimes went on to be discharged and then violently reoffended. The families of Timothy McLean and the Brentwood Five feel it's not worth the risk and believe an absolute discharge for serious violent offenders should be taken off the table. They're hoping an MP would bring this forward in Parliament, and that would require public support. In the meantime, Matthew DeGrood has another hearing coming up, and he will likely be seeking increased freedoms.
I'm Anthony Robart. Thank you for joining us tonight on Crime Beat.
For more on this story and other high-profile Canadian cases, check out Crime Beat Podcast. You can listen for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on CuriousCast.ca.